Welcome back, dear delegates, and a pleasant afternoon to all of you. Before we begin, I would like to recall, if you would like to know on the overall schedule on the symposium, feel free to download our program book and DA11 handbook extract for you to know the details of our overall program throughout the 4-day event, which are readily available on our website, www.da11-virtualplatform.com. For our second session this afternoon, the topic to be discussed will be all about epidemiology. It is my pleasure to introduce to you our moderator for the oral presentation session. Our moderator is Dr. P.K. Pradhan, who is presently working as a principal scientist in Fish Health Management and Exotics Division of ICAR, National Bureau of Fish Genetic Resources, India. Dr. Pradhan is a member of the National Surveillance Program for Aquatic Animal Diseases in India. He has been involved in studying host pathogen interaction of important fish pathogens. Dr. Pradhan has worked extensively on infection with pathogen Aphanomyces invadens. He and his teams have been successful in developing treatment for umicid diseases, which is being used by the fish farmers with promising results. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Dr. P.K. Pradhan.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Liana, for the nice introduction. I'm really pleased to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Kenton Lloyd Morgan, for the session on epidemiology. Professor Kenton Morgan was the first professor of epidemiology at a British veterinary school. He is a veterinarian with postgraduate degree in mucosal immunity. A graduate of the University of Cambridge, he developed his interest and skills in epidemiology and practical preventive medicine at the University of Bristol. He was introduced to aquaculture after a Scotland versus Wales rugby game by Professor James Turnbull of the University of Stirling. Together with Dr. C.V. Mohan and Nguyen Van Hao, they pioneered the application of quantitative epidemiology to aquaculture in India and Vietnam. He has held epidemiology courses in USA, Europe, India, and Japan, where he was visiting professor at Nagasaki University. He is a guiding force behind India's National Surveillance Program for Aquatic Animal Diseases. His novel and hands on teaching techniques have attracted international acclaim. Topic of his keynote presentation is investment, training, resources, rigor, and speed, a paradigm for aquatic epidemiology. Now I request to play the presentation of Professor Kenton Morgan.
Good afternoon from my hometown in West Wales. I'd like to thank the organisers for giving me the opportunity to talk to you by video. It's a first for me, and also for organising a time that's suitable for me too. 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I think we're about 5 or 6 hours behind you. Behind me you can see the railway line which goes from my native country of Wales up to London. And beyond that, you can see the estuary that I grew up on. This is where I learned about sailing, fishing, swimming. I've walked this estuary and caught flatfish with my feet. I've seine net fished with the fishermen. I learned how to row here. And in the distance on the hillside, you see one of the Norman castles that was built to suppress the Welsh and to try and keep them in line. In my case, they failed. I hope you enjoy the presentation. It's meant to be provocative. I'm passionate about epidemiology, and I think aquatic epidemiology is simply in an inadequate state at the moment. We need more people, and you need to see people who are much younger than me presenting these keynote talks. Thank you and enjoy.
What we need to determine is this. For every person who gets sick, how many other people are they likely to infect? So, for seasonal flu, that's usually about 1. Smallpox, on the other hand, it's over 3. Now, before we had a vaccine, polio spread at a rate between 4 and 6. Now, we call that number the R0. R stands for the reproductive rate of the virus.
Any ideas what that might be for this?
How fast it multiplies depends on a variety of factors. The incubation period, how long a person is contagious. Sometimes people can be contagious without even having symptoms. We need to know that too. And we need to know how big the population of people susceptible to the virus might be.
So far, that appears to be everyone with hands, a mouth, and a nose.
Once we know the R0, we'll be able to get a handle on the scale of the epidemic.
So it's an epidemic now.
The last few years of the COVID epidemic has been a game changer for all of us. And there have been very few winners. One of the few may be epidemiology and epidemiologists. In the movie clip of Contagion, you saw Kate Winslet explaining R0 to a group of government officials. R0 is something that was once confined to theoretical epidemiologists. A lot of practical field epidemiologists even didn't know what R0 meant. Now, almost every member of the public knows about the R number. The R number is something we've followed religiously. How is it? 1.1, 1.2, 0.9, 1.6. It literally became equivalent like British people talking about the weather. The other thing you saw in the movie clip was the difficulty in concepts and perceptions of epidemiology and how influential words can be. So the word epidemic, for example, becomes immediately scary. The word pandemic, even more scary. And we're going to explore those words in a moment.
Our lives right now are pretty much controlled by something called R0, also known as the R number. It tells us how many people will likely get infected for every one person who gets ill with coronavirus. If the reproductive number is 2, then one person will probably make 2 others sick, and so the disease spreads. If it's 3, then it'll be around 3. Without a cure or vaccine, this R number guides every decision governments make to fight this pandemic. Before changes were brought in to reduce the spread of coronavirus, its R number was between 2 and 3, which is why it spread so quickly. The aim is for it to be less than 1 and to keep it there so health services can cope.
They saw a clip from the BBC explaining R0 a little bit more accurately and in a little bit more detail than Kate Winslet did in Contagion. I have to confess that I use Contagion in the middle of the courses I run, mainly as a social activity and a time for people to look at the potential impact of an epidemic. The last time I showed it, I thought, I'm going to stop showing this because it's a little bit far-fetched. Well, now it became the most popular movie viewed during the COVID pandemic. I want to now go on to explore the word epidemic. Epidemic is simply an incidence, that is the number of cases over time, which is greater than normal. So here you can see a graph which shows the number of cases over time, and you get some fluctuation, and then you get a rapid rise where the epidemic occurs. Now,
if a country was free of disease, and therefore there was no fluctuation, just a flat line, one case, just one case, would be an epidemic. So an epidemic has nothing to do with the overall number of cases over time. It's a change in the number from that seen historically. I hope that's clear. So if there are no cases, one case can be an epidemic. If there are thousands of cases every day, then 1,000 cases in a day is just normal. If there are 5 cases a day, and then it suddenly increases to 200 cases a day, then you have an epidemic. So there is some confusion over the use of the word epidemic, and I hope this clarifies it. R0 is based on the conception of mass action. And here you see the little red and blue balls are just randomly bumping into each other. And so R0 calculations are based on this random process. Of course, this is not what really happens in real life. In reality, the connections between individuals or farms, in this case, are not random. They're based on an interconnecting network. And you see these connections may be one direction or two directions. They may be movement of animals, movement of feed, or movement of personnel. Let's now look at the effect of understanding this network on our ability to control disease transmission within the network. For the purpose of doing this, I've colored some farms in yellow and other farms in red. And I want to look at the effect of removal or isolation of these farms from the network. You see, if we remove the yellow colored farms from the network, it has very little effect on the transmission and the interconnections within this network. In contrast, if we remove the red farms on this network, then you see that transmission within the network is completely disrupted. Therefore, understanding these networks, understanding the pattern in these networks, and understanding the effect of these super spreaders, if you like, of these particular farms that allow transmission to be spread to a number of different farms can be important in disease control. In contrast, if we look at a similar geographical distribution of farms displayed by a similar pattern of their arrangement on this slide, but having very, very different interconnections, and this we call a random network, then if we remove the red farms from this network, we see that it has very little difference on the interconnections within the network and the ability of disease to transmit across this network. Therefore, R0, a useful concept, but based on random motion. In reality, farms or individuals are connected through social networks or through economic networks. Understanding those networks is critical to future disease control. And certainly in the epidemic of COVID, people tried to do this by having mobile phones that allowed you to identify another mobile phone that you were near and to centralize this so that connections between people could be recorded. This actually didn't work. I'm familiar that this had been tried earlier with flu, and there are all sorts of problems related to confidentiality. One thing that the COVID pandemic has taught us is that age-old methods of disease control are still highly effective in preventing the transmission of infectious disease. Identify infected individuals and stay away from them, either by isolating the infected individuals or by socially distancing from all individuals, in which case you're concerned that transmission may take place before people are symptomatic. So these techniques have been used for a number of years for disease control. And that's a marvelous thing about epidemiology, is its simplicity. You may say, but how can you identify infected individuals if you don't have a diagnostic test? Surely you must have to find out what causes a disease before you try and prevent it. Of course not. In this case, we simply used the symptoms: continuous cough, temperature or fever, loss or a change in taste, and a loss or a change in smell. You may say, but how can those be specific? Well, this is a case definition, and like all case definitions, they're diagnostic tests. And like all diagnostic tests, they're not 100% accurate. You get false positives and false negatives. But in the absence of knowing what causes a disease and having a method of culturing or PCRing or using antigen to identify its presence, then coming up with a clinical case definition and sticking to it can be very effective in disease control. Let's then look at this concept, this very important concept of case definition. Historically, a number of aquatic diseases were identified and defined by the appearance of affected animals or their behavior. And here you see a list of them. Some of these names are still used to describe the diseases. So from the outset, a case definition was used. So remember, case definition, important to establish it. It's just like a diagnostic test. And like all diagnostic tests, it has those two marvelous properties: sensitivity and specificity. And those of you who've been on my courses or who would like to catch me later can see how you can use a diagnostic test in a population that has no disease, in which you have a slaughter policy to slowly kill all the animals in that population because you think they're infected when no disease was actually present. The use of words in epidemics can be particularly important. Quarantine, for example, comes from the original quarante giorni, of 40 days. It was the time that ships were held outside Venice during the plague. But the word quarantine can be frightening. It can be evocative to people who perhaps have been involved in tuberculosis control in the past. So governments have been very cautious in the use of this word, preferring to use words like isolation. Certainly my involvement in the original SARS epidemic, quarantine was not a word that we wanted to use because it was so fearful and evocative. The word pandemic is in a similar category. And when WHO declared COVID a pandemic, there was a certain aura that was attached to this. But of course, in aquaculture, we're used to pandemics. EUS spread across the world. It was a pandemic. It had a massive impact on lives, livelihoods, biodiversity, and fish populations. But it certainly didn't attract the attention that COVID attracted, or indeed a terrestrial animal disease such as foot and mouth. The pandemic of white spot disease has been nothing short of remarkable. It has changed the species of shrimp that have been domesticated worldwide from monodon to vanamai. An infectious disease has altered the pattern of domestication. It reminds me that we're seeing the domestication of aquatic species in real time, something that happened tens of thousands of years ago for terrestrial animals. Did the dodo die out because when they tried to domesticate it, it suffered from some severe infectious disease? If history teaches us anything, it's important that we learn from it. And if we look back and ask the question, well, why wasn't the spread of EUS and white spot disease prevented? Why was it allowed to become a pandemic? And here I want to look at the lack of knowledge or expertise, of infrastructure, of finance, and also of political will. At the time these two diseases were identified, There was only a handful of epidemiologists in the world with an interest in aquaculture, maybe even less than half a dozen. In fact, looking at this slide, I'm not sure that there are as many epidemiologists in the world today as there are fish in this person's hand with a specific interest in aquatic epidemiology. The consequence of this was that when international organizations ran missions into countries where outbreaks of the diseases occurred, they had absolute experts on identifying infectious agents. Their collection of biological samples was exemplary. In contrast, their collection of questionnaire data, which might have been useful in identifying routes of transmission of these diseases, was simply rudimentary and inadequate. The use of the word epizootic rather than epidemic is an example of this. And if I can make a plea now, please do not use the word epizootiology. If I see it in the title of a paper that I referee, I know immediately that the people writing this are unlikely to be epidemiologists. So epidemiology, not epizootiology. I don't make this plea alone. It was made in a letter to Nature in 1994 by then some of the most eminent veterinary epidemiologists in the world. They make the point that if you use the word epizootiology, then if you're looking at diseases in populations of fish, you might use epiichthyology, or if they're birds, epiornithology, and this leads to a proliferation of unnecessary terms. So 28 years ago, these eminent epidemiologists suggested that the term epizootic and epizootiology be completely removed from the scientific literature. And by and large, everyone involved in veterinary epidemiology throughout the world has complied with this. As a result, research institutes such as this one in Bangkok, which was headed by my dear friend with such a beautiful voice, Subrani Chinnaput, were perfectly set up to study infectious agents, but did not have any epidemiological expertise. This is no criticism of the institutes, or the individuals within them, or the intention. It's simply that the expertise to do that wasn't present. Until recently, the different financial demands of epidemiology and laboratory science have presented a problem, whereas spending £10,000 on a laminar flow cabinet would be acceptable in a grant or project application, requesting a similar amount for fuel to go out to farms to collect data which might assist in understanding transmission was simply not acceptable. There was also a lack of political will, a failure perhaps to recognize that we live on an aquatic planet and that we're fortunate to have land to live on. We see floods as an invasion of our territory rather than the fact that we are actually fortunate to have land to live on. As a result, the investment in space exploration was considerably more than the investment in understanding our oceans. It is nothing short of incredible that over 4,000 people have been to the highest point on Earth, but only 3 or possibly 4 have been to the deepest point of our oceans. How can this be? Okay, let's take a pause for a moment and let's go to quiz time. Here's question 1. You're part of an international panel which has to prioritize spending on disease control. You're sitting at the table, beautifully air-conditioned hotel, just before lunch, and you're considering 2 diseases. Disease A has killed only 10 animals. Disease B has killed 5.5 million animals. Which one are you going to spend your money on, A or B? Now let's look at the populations that were affected. Disease A affected the vaquita. less than 20 in the world. It killed 50% of the entire population. In contrast, disease B was in the human population of 8 billion, and it killed only 0.07 of the population. And whilst every individual death in this population is tragic, and I apologize here to people who may have lost dear ones during the COVID epidemic, the point is that the impact on the population is very different. So the right answer to this question is really neither A nor B, because using numbers to measure the importance of disease depends on the total population at risk. So let's look at these words of Arthur C. Clarke, science fiction writer, explorer, inventor, and lesser known underwater explorer. Only small minds are impressed by large numbers. I have 4 boys, and they all grew up with this as a dictum in the family. Life is denominator based. We make decisions based on denominators. And for those of you who might have forgotten what a denominator is, or like me at one stage didn't even know, here's a reminder. Look at the power of denominators. Allows proportions, percentages to be estimated, allows risk to be estimated. And remember that in statistics, risk and probability were the same thing. It's only recently that risk has been used with negative implications. It allows rational decision making. Life is denominator based. And it's the basis of relative risk or risk ratio, which is a cornerstone of analytical evidence. Another scenario, fisheries officer contacts you. Shrimp, farm with 6 ponds, showing clinical signs that they've never seen before. What questions might you ask? What control measures might you do? And what are some things you would do to investigate possible causes of this problem? Just take a moment to reflect on this. Here are some of the things you might do. The first is speed. Speed is of the essence. Time wasted in the early parts of an epidemic have been shown to be disastrous later on. This was shown for foot and mouth disease and also shown for COVID. So speed important. Communicate. Tell people. Tell people immediately. Isolate. Then begin to look at the pattern of disease over time. Draw an epidemic curve, establish a case definition, and decide what study design you're going to use to investigate this problem. This is an example of the pattern of disease over time. It shows the number of cases every day for measles over 1970. Now, we know that measles is infectious, but actually if we didn't, then this pattern would tell us that we're dealing with an infectious disease. You can see that around about the 12th of November 1970, there's a small rise in the number of cases. There's very clearly epidemic by between the 19th and the 26th. This actually increases to a further peak at the 5th of December and around the 17th of December. By measuring the distance between these peaks, we can get an incubation period. So without knowing the cause, we know from this pattern of disease occurrence over time that we're dealing with an infectious disease, and we know its incubation period, the power of an epidemic curve. Defining what we're studying is relatively easy. We've done this before. We establish a case definition, we write it down, and we stick to it. If a pond or an animal doesn't fulfill the case definition, it's not a case. There's no question of it, well, it's being slightly a case, or it's almost a case. If there are grey feces in the pond, and our definition is white feces, or if there are yellow feces in this pond, and our definition is white feces, it doesn't fit the case definition. Remember, there will always be false positives and false negatives. It's a diagnostic test. Finally, we need to decide what study design we're going to use to investigate this problem. Most likely we'll use a case control study, which is an outbreak investigation. Other three classical designs in observational epidemiology are cross-sectional, case control, and cohort. But I'll leave you to Google those. What I want to focus on here is some of the endearing features of epidemiology. That is, you don't need to know what causes a disease to prevent it. You don't learn much about an infection or disease by studying infected or diseased animals. They have to be compared with controls. An epidemic curve can tell you it's infectious. Risk factor has a specific definition. It's a variable with a statistical association with the disease of interest. A risk factor can increase or decrease the risk of disease. It's not something that's blandly thrown around. It has a definition, as does confounding. The thing about epidemiology is it's easy to do badly. Before I move on to non-infectious aspects of epidemiology, I'm aware that my time is running out, so I want to really finish quickly. And the first thing I want to mention is investment. India has to be applauded for the investment it's made in national surveillance on aquatic animal disease. And I love this quote from my friend, Dr. Jenner. India has made its own example. It has really come from nowhere, and I've been part of that, in seeing people who had little epidemiological knowledge, who didn't know each other very well, evolve into rapid reaction task forces, who've embraced the concept of epidemiology and embraced the concept of transparency in disease reporting. It really is exemplary, and I'm pleased that this program is going to continue. The second thing I want to mention is the importance of people in surveillance and in aquatic epidemiology in general. And I'm going to make a confession here that this paper was one of the few papers I've written in anger, because Cécile Brugère, Dennis and I wrote an application for a grant as part of a BBSRC workshop, and it was an excellent grant. But it was one of the only grants, I think, that were written during that workshop which wasn't funded. And in anger, we wrote this paper, which I think is now cited somewhere near 50 times, which indicates the importance of people in aquatic disease surveillance, which was really the program of our proposed grant. I recommend it to you. Field epidemiology is such good fun. I can't impress that upon you enough. Getting out and talking to farmers in field conditions, you learn so much every moment of the day. And it's this attention to detail in data collection in the field that really improves our understanding, not just of disease control, but of evolving methods of fish culture and fish husbandry. And although I think this is a model on this bike, probably never been near a fish or an animal in his life, this picture actually illustrates the importance of motorbikes that all over the world now are going out to fish farms and to cattle herds and even to human populations to collect epidemiological data. The COVID pandemic has changed the landscape. People realize the importance of collecting these data and collecting it well. They realize that it is as important as a laminar flow cabinet.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Kenton, for the excellent presentation. It has been really like a professor teaching the students. No, now you ask the floor is open for questions. I don't see any questions in the chat box. I have a question, Professor Kenton, for you. Hello, can you hear?
Yeah, I can hear you, Pradhan.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, sir. Yeah, you see the Asia is a leading aquaculture producing region in the globally, but no, we must confess this branch of science is not developing. So what is your vision or how you see that it can improve in the future?
Thanks for the question, Pradhan. I think it does require the will of those people who hold the purse strings, who have influence, and it also requires the opportunity for young people. So simply sending someone away on a course to become to develop their skills in epidemiology is insufficient. They need to be part of a project where they can explore and consolidate those skills. The other issue, I think, is epidemiological skills are easily transferable. So someone who is trained in aquatic epidemiology or trained in epidemiology and is required to apply them to aquaculture could easily be snapped up in other areas such as human health or terrestrial animal health. So I think it really needs to earmark individuals, to train them, but to put them in an environment where they can use those skills.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, another, it's not a question, it's a request. Professor, can you think of writing a simple book on aquatic epidemiology, which can be used by many students, particularly, very simpler terms.
Pradhan, there are many good books around, and the Bible is one produced by Ian DeHoo. It's got a yellow and green facade. It really is a good book for practical epidemiology. I'm still teaching courses, as you know, and you know how much I enjoy the interaction with students and teaching those courses, and I'm happy to continue doing those.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, all the participants are requested to put the question in the chat box. We must avail this opportunity. If there are no questions, I think really grateful to you, Professor Kenton, and yeah, for the excellent presentation. It is like a real teaching in the classroom. We all enjoyed it. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.